Hello and welcome to another episode of Candor and Conviction. On April 26, we had a conversation with Juan Pablo Villasmil. Juan Pablo is an Intercollegiate Studies Institute editorial fellow at The Spectator and a graduate student in Georgetown University's Security Studies program. JP has interned in both chambers of Congress as well as several think tanks. He often writes about foreign policy and Gen Z culture. In our conversation, we talked about his life here in the US, about the wars both in Ukraine and in Israel. We also had the opportunity to talk about the protests in college campuses and what should be the position of the United States when it comes to foreign policy. In this conversation, we're going to dive deep into these topics to know more about what's happening around the world, what's the mentality of the US, and what should be the steps moving forward. I hope you enjoy it, and if you haven't done it, like and subscribe to the channel to support more conversations like this. Juan Pablo, thank you so much for joining us. Something I wanted to ask you, and I know that your situation is very particular because my understanding is that you were born here in the US. However, you were raised in Venezuela. So I would like to know more about that. Like, why did your parents decide to come to the US? Why did you decide to come to the US? Um, Besides all the other countries that, you know, immigrants could come. I think I like to ask that question to some of the guests,
Yeah.
especially since you have lived in a different country and you had the option to go to other countries as well.
Yeah. So I was born in 2001 here in Florida, where I am right now. And my dad opened the business here, and they stayed here for a while. But I grew most of my life in Venezuela. Um, Most of my childhood, of course. Although I would come to the U.S. a lot, and I think the reasons is just the reasons that most immigrants cite. Like my family knew even when back then the future for Venezuela was not that uncertain because 2001, things were starting. Like Chavez was getting into power, but no one thought it was gonna get that bad. Like even the people who say like, yeah, like things are gonna get that bad, they exaggerate. Like no one knew it. We would always go like, people in Venezuela would always go like, yeah, Cuba's an island. We are like an actual country. We have lots of oil. So that's not gonna happen to us. Then it happened. So we would go to the US a lot, and I definitely had my future in the US, but my entire family uh, decided to make the final move to permanently settle in Florida in 2016. And ever
Okay,
since then, we've been here. So we chilling.
that's good. That's awesome. And it's very funny what you mentioned about people saying that things um, can get worse. I think there are two sides of that coin. And it's like some people who say uh, things cannot get worse. And then there
Yeah.
are people who say, yeah, things can always get worse. And I tend to side a little more with the first one, or sorry, with the latter one, which is I think things can always get worse. I think if people
Yeah.
and that's certainly something that happened in Venezuela, just like our friends in Cuba. Obviously, Miami is a great example of those two migrations coming to this country.
Mhm.
Is But it has happened throughout history over and over again. It seems like it doesn't seem like something that can happen elsewhere. Um, for those people who live in a free society. And certainly one of the reasons for the US to be such a magnet for migrants, especially in the past years, I think is because we see it as the free country that the US is. So, last place you will think on earth could go through some type of authoritarian regime is the US. Um, However, we have seen that the US has different challenges, challenges that come in the global sphere as the one superpower that other countries rely on. And during Biden's presidency, we have seen how the US has gotten himself in a lot of trouble. Starting 2022 with the biggest incident with Russia invading Ukraine. Then we saw October 7th this year, Hamas um, surprisingly attacks Israel and leaves over 1,200 people that were killed or kidnapped in other cases. And over 35 of those people were Americans. So here's my question for you, especially knowing that you have some studies in this field, is how how can how can the US act moving forward? And do we need a change in leadership?
Well, that's a broad question. A change in leadership, of course. Like maybe we need a new president in the White House and so on. Uh, but more than anything else, I think we need a change in strategy. And this is not as drastic as we think, because when you actually read Biden's geopolitical strategy, it's not that incoherent. Like I was reading their Indo-Pacific strategy recently, and it's all pretty reasonable. They talk about prioritizing the development of ROK, South Korea, uh, Taiwanese, Japanese relations. They don't mention Taiwan actually. U.S. South Korea, Japanese relations, but that's obviously in relation to Taiwan. They talk about advancing um, security goals in that region in the Indo-Pacific. And the more you read into the strategy, the more you say like, "Hey, this is all pretty reasonable." But broadly speaking, when we look at the world, there are two regions that deserve more attention, but comparatively speaking, they're receiving less. And those regions are number one, the Indo Pacific, and number two, the Western Hemisphere, Latin America specifically. Um, we, of course, know a lot about the latter, but in regard to the former, the world's population, 60% of it resides in Asia. Sooner rather than later, 50% of the world's GDP is going to be concentrated in Asia. So whoever dominates Asia will likely dominate the world. Uh, the US is a regional power in Asia, but that could quickly change if China decides to, you know, do what they want to do. Will they? There's actually a lot of people that disagree. I've read recently some articles that say that, like China doesn't have the balls to invade Taiwan. But I've also read some articles of very intelligent people saying that they will do it very soon. Um, but I think whatever we think about what exactly is going to happen with Taiwan, China wants to grow, and they want to grow Sun Tzu style, which is trying to win a war without actually fighting. Um, so I don't. I personally think that when we look at this reality, when we look at the fact that China has a pretty competent regime, and of course they're a huge nation, there are our fiercest geopolitical, economic competitor ever. Like the Soviet Union was, a
Yeah,
competitor, but not like China. Um,
yeah, absolutely.
so when we look at what's happening in the world right now, we have a lot of eyes in Europe, understandably so, and a lot of eyes in the Middle East. And what I fear is that if we fixate on those two regions and we don't elevate some of our allies, some of our friends in those regions, and we don't make them take a stronger role, if we were to confront increasing conflict in the Indo Pacific and in Latin America, we would find ourselves in a weaker position. Because the reality is, people don't like to say this because, our friendship with other countries, but when it comes down to it, like we are better friends with Europe than they are with us. And, that's okay. Like the US is the most powerful country. Sure. But if this happened in human relationships, and I don't like to make like comparisons between like humans and countries because they're different things. Like a country is a country, a human is a human. But if this happened with humans, we would call Europe like toxic. We'd be
Yeah.
like, yo, get a divorce. Forget about that girl. Like if Europe was a girl, we would be like, nah, bro, like she's asking, but she does nothing. Um, which is a silly metaphor, but it's true. And the reason why I know this is because when you look at most European countries, although Germany recently, Italy has made some symbolic moves in regard to China, they don't say anything. Like many of them just wash their hands and they're like, okay, U.S., you handle that. But when it comes to Ukraine, uh, they raise their fingers and they say like, hey, democracy, the US needs to step in. If they don't step in, they are abandoning democracy. And it's like, what about like potential conflict in China? Do you guys care about that? And the
Yeah.
reality is that they care less. Why? Because it's not their region. Russia's
Mhm.
right there.
Also, they benefit from them, right? Like the whole world does. They benefit from China, and unlike the US, who has an open competition with China and can somehow defend itself, I think that these countries feel hostage to two powerful countries. But um, I would say that the US has a play to roll in all this when it comes to, as you well articulated, I think pressuring European countries to put more of their resources to attend to these issues is something vital right now because um, the reason why we keep hearing all these people making assumptions or trying to make predictions about when China is gonna go for Taiwan, it's because it's very clear that the US is in a very vulnerable position worldwide, and and that's a good timing for China to do a move. If I wanted to ever make if they wanted to ever make a move, will be while they see all the things happening around the world and the
Mhm.
US having to confront all of them at the same time. So it's not it's not a secret that China, Russia, Iran, all of these countries are together seeking for the downfall of the US, as this has been the case historically. And they have um, a lot of different coalitions between them that support the case for them to not necessarily to be friends. Um, because I wouldn't say they are like friends, as they will never have an argument in that sense, but they have a common enemy. And I think that the US has lost that vision of having common enemies. It used to be for a lot of history that the US and the free world had a common enemy who were these authoritarian dictators around the globe. But it seems like the US almost has lost his common um, their like their common goal or the common fight for something in the world. And all these countries that are dictators, if there is an advantage about being a dictatorship, is that you never have to change your foreign policy. You always have the same goals. Whereas
Mhm.
the US does not. The US does not need to have um, a goal for the world. So I think that's a big advantage for all these authoritarian regimes around the globe, and I think that we have seen the rising of this mentality not only abroad but also inside the U.S. We have seen it with recent protests around college campuses when it comes to Hamas. Um, Whereas in the past, you will never see uh, college students protesting about this. It's not only the college students; it's all around the U.S.
Well, we
And
did see some similar protests with South Africa, right? Back then in 1960s, California and so on.
yeah,
What I what I before we move on
yeah, of course.
international relations here, I think you made a really good point about having a common enemy in the past, and this is something that we should worry about because you're completely right, and everyone seems to notice except some of the think tank leaders in the U.S., which is really funny, and it's that there is a common Western inheritance, and there's this tradition uh, passed on first by Christianity and then by a set of liberal principles in the
Mhm.
traditional sense, like free expression and so on. And that's all really nice. And that's what unified us when the common enemy was the Soviet Union. You're
Yep.
completely right. But what we know now for a fact, and this is something that the EU states, uh, oh my God, I forgot his name. What's his name? Joseph Borrell? Joseph Borrell, yeah. Joseph Borrell made a statement not too long ago. I think it was 2021. You guys can fact check me. But he said that he believes that the world is becoming increasingly transactional and that the EU has to adapt to that transactionality. What he meant by this, and he details this, you know, more clearly in his statement, is that the EU has to treat relationships worldwide as strictly commercial relationships. What does that mean? I'll summarize it for you. That means that when it comes to China and the US, he believes that the EU's position should be like, okay, like we're not going to do anything. We're going to benefit from our economic relationships. The US is a great historic partner. They help us militarily, but China has a great market. So we're just going to stand here and we're going to be transactional.
Yep.
Um, and that's a reality that we can't ignore. And
Yep.
when the U.S. continues to talk in a principled manner, what we
Mhm.
forget, and this is, I'm not making the case to like act without principles. Like, of course, we need principles, um, but we do need to acknowledge that the world, our allies even, are becoming increasingly transactional. And
Mhm.
only when we acknowledge this reality can we actually move forward. If we stop talking about Latin America and the
Mhm.
Middle East, for example, as like, we need to spread democracy and fight communism, and more like, hey, it's not good to have these people govern here. Why? Because they are funding terrorism, because it
Mhm.
affects our national security, and also because it affects our economy, because they have a lot of natural resources and China is exploiting them and we need them if we want, of course these
Yep.
arguments are difficult to make in like the public sphere. Like Biden is not going to grab the microphone and be like, we need oil, we need critical minerals. uh, He's not going to be like, we're going to defend the Middle East because we don't want Russia and China to take advantage of the, you know.
Yeah.
He's not going to
Yeah.
say that. He's going to make
For
it about
sure.
principles.
Absolutely.
But we
No,
should
I agree with that.
demand that they do. We should demand that they act in a more
Transactional
realistic
way.
manner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that all makes sense. I think I just believe from what I've seen, or I think that many people can see this, is that around the world has become more transactional, as you well said, and I don't think the US is necessarily the exception to that. I just think that once you become transactional, you really have to make really good cases for why it's wrong for certain governments to act the way they do.
Hmm.
And when you have to make those really good cases, it turns out that, and I put this an obvious example, Venezuela. By the time that you make the good argument that Venezuela is funded by terrorists and that the US is suffering because of that, and all of this list of cases, at that point, it's just it has been the country has been taken over so deeply by
Hmm.
Russians and Chinese and all of these other countries that it's almost impossible to take it back at that point. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't disagree with that analysis. I do believe that things need to be transactional, but I also believe that if you don't have that first principle um, to act prior those things happen, then you get yourself in a very messy situation because there is very little you can do moving forward. Um,
Yeah.
so it's definitely
I mean,
it's
I'd be
something hard.
careful with the word act. What do you mean by act?
Well, I'll say it's not the same putting sanctions in a country that is already being ruled by
Yeah.
Russia and China um, than putting sanctions in a government that you saw before that was already acting in an undemocratic way and abusing the powers inside of it.
So yeah.
Because they're just not as effective at that point. They don't mean that much, and I think uh, we have seen that repeatedly in modern history how the U.S. reacts extremely late to all of these situations to the point
Yeah.
that they just allow for those countries to really have very little options to do anything else other than submit to the power of the ones who took over them by terrorist actions and other actually like dictators all over the world are not they used to say that we have our hands clean and we're not doing anything, but they're not doing that anymore. They're fine with everybody knowing because there is nothing. They
Yeah.
see that there is nothing the US can do about that. Because the US, unlike them, has no has became a philosophy of not wanting not wanting to do anything on the global sphere other than being a very outside judge that doesn't do almost anything. And instead of being the main character of the picture as it used to be for a long time, it's really just another guy that shows up in the picture like, hey, here I am, just so you
Yeah.
guys know.
And in our hemisphere, that was even more so the case. You know, like I
Yeah.
understand the isolationist instinct of a lot of folks, and to some degree, I feel it too sometimes. Like living in the U.S. Sometimes I have that instinct taking over, which is like, why do we need to care about the world? Which is funny because I studied like international relations, but a lot of times I felt myself just like thinking to myself, like, I don't care about Africa. I don't care about I don't care about Iraq. Like, why are we like spending time there? And I understand that sentiment, but the best example is for hemisphere. Like, our failure to act in regard to our hemisphere. And by act, I mean what you mean. I mean, like, our failure to analyze the situation on the ground correctly and take steps to prevent um, regimes from further expanding
Yep.
and further challenging American power in the region, and further really insulting the United States, is really what's to blame partly to why we are in the situation today. Like, when Democrats back in 2016, they've changed their talking points a bit. They used to say, like, if we want to tackle immigration, we want to go to the root problem of illegal immigration. We want to go to the root problem. And by that, they meant the opposite. Like, they meant
Yeah.
something like we need to stop sanctioning Cuba and Venezuela to
Yeah. Well, they
to
wouldn't say
reduce.
they wouldn't say illegal immigrants anymore. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
how
yeah.
far they.
So, like, to reduce illegal immigration, they would
Hmm.
advocate for the opposite that was needed. What I would
Yeah.
say is that, like, Republicans do need a bit of that logic without leading to the same conclusions. By
Mm.
that I mean is that we need to look at the roots, but when we look at the roots, our conclusion should be, hey, maybe we should have a role in the region
Yeah.
and exert
Absolutely.
exert exert with confidence, avoiding conflict. We don't want to. We
Yeah.
don't want war. We
Of
don't
course.
want
Yeah.
to. We don't want to get involved in direct conflict with, like, let's say Bolivia or something. Like, it's not cool. That's
Yeah.
not good. But we need to exert our power, and we need to make sure that the rest of the world knows that in our hemisphere, in our so-called backyard, or maybe front yard or whatever yard, this is our playground. This
Yeah.
is this is the
That's
U.S.'s region. This is where we deserve to be respected most, and that's
yeah. I
not
think
happening.
I think that's just such a not controversial thing. Is it because if you told me about some far away place in the world, and we still have I think the US always has a duty to be the the most powerful country in the world, and having to do something with every conflict that arises around the world. But when it comes to your atmosphere, as you well illustrated, is you really need boots in the ground when it comes to those things. And boots in the ground, that's as you well said, doesn't mean conflict. I
You
mean,
can't
I
wait.
no, I'm being serious with that, and I put as a perfect example Colombia
Yeah,
recently with Petro. It's like we do have relationships for many years with Colombia. There are U.S. bases
yeah,
in Colombia. There there is ways to have a very clear relationship that ensures the stability of the region without having to further escalate.
yeah.
And I think that more of that needs to be applied in this atmosphere. So, well, I think that was a lot of talk about global issues, and I think we both agree that there needs to be more.
Hmm.
The U.S. needs to do more in this region, and that the approach around the world needs to change. Um, at least from the current administration, I feel that um, they have been really good in getting in more conflicts that the U.S. can handle.
Yeah.
Um, and
The experts, the professionals.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
all the professionals. And but going to a topic that is not too far, actually not that different. I wanted to ask you about your opinions about what we've seen in college
yeah.
and the protests around the country.
You asked
What's
it before. You asked it before. So
yeah.
I'll dive right in, because I meddled with your podcast because I was like, I want to talk more about intraday relations. But back to the colleges. I think that what's happening in the colleges is it's really you know, first, my personal take. I think a lot of the protesters are saying really grotesque things.
Hmm.
especially some of the chants I heard at Columbia. And I definitely think that this reflects very poorly on internal U.S. Social dynamics. Like we have a really divided population in which the younger generation, Generation C, Generation Alpha, I think they're going to call them when they grow up older. Uh, these generations seem to be slowly becoming more, for example, pro-Palestine, while older generations tend to be very staunchly pro-Israel. And we do see these divisions with a lot of things. We see them with like public opinion on like abortion and so on. But in
Hmm.
regard to foreign policy, those are like especially stark. Like young people tend to be much more pro Palestine than older folks.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
we have that point of view first. Sure. But then the other thing that concerns me, and I'm sure you probably saw when I posted it on my Instagram, is that I do have concerns about free expression,
Free speech. Yeah.
which takes me to point two. And by this, I mean like the principle of free expression.
Hmm.
Because legality, of course, is always more complicated. Like, yeah, private universities can do whatever they want, but if I work at Apple, right, and they're a private company or publicly owned in this case or whatever, and they just like ban people from talking about politics in general, or they like said like we're not going to employ anyone who posts a picture with a MAGA hat or something, I would still protest that. I'd be like, hey, this is wrong,
Yeah.
even if they're a private company. And what I'm seeing in regard to pro-Palestinian protesters is that there are a lot of folks who are obviously pro-Israel, and
Yeah.
I tend to agree with them over the some of these like pro-Hamas folks. Like they're crazy in the head, but um, they take it a bit too far. A lot of them do, and they completely abandon the principle of free expression and free association. They just go, send the National Guard. These people are literally terrorists. These people, and they'll use like private property language to like justify
Yeah.
uh, their what it's actually informed by their foreign policy, religious and individual inclinations. Like they'll be like, private property. Colombia has the right to do whatever they want, and in reality, then you click on their profiles on like X, and they have like an Israeli flag and everything, and I tend to agree with them on the foreign policy decisions again, but like, don't try to make this like a case about like why in this case it's okay to silence them because private. You're clearly saying this because you hate them, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and this is exactly what we should avoid because like liberals have done this with conservatives, right? They've been like,
Yeah.
universities can do whatever they want. This is an unsafe environment. Ben Shapiro cannot come to the school. And that's wrong. Like free
Yeah.
expression is all about letting people talk, even if you strongly disagree with them, letting them protest, even. You know, and there's some parameters like don't destroy stuff, don't burn things down. But in principle, what most of these pro-Palestinian protesters are doing might not be what I necessarily agree with, but they have a right to do it. And actually, in doing it, this might sound a bit too like meta. In doing it, they benefit us more than they harm us. Like when we let people protest, we avoid conspiracy. We avoid strong factions from becoming dangerous factions. Because when
Yeah.
you know who's protesting, when you know who they are, or you know where they're at, then you can recognize the faction. You can recognize maybe the problem. You can recognize the disagreement. But if you just shut down disagreement, what might happen is one or two. They will organize behind the scenes, under the ground, and they might plan something really bad. Or number two, they might not organize, but one day that social anxiety, that social anger might explode.
Yes.
And we don't want that to happen. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I mostly agree with that. I was, yeah. I agree with that. I think that conservatives have, for the longest time, as they should, uh, said that free speech must apply to everybody, even if they disagree with. Like that famous quote about, "I disagree with you, but I will die for your right to say what you think."
Who said that? I always see that.
I had it in my
I
mind, and I
always see
thought,
that
like,
quote, and they go like
yeah,
Thomas Jefferson, and then it'd be
yeah.
it's like George Washington, and I'm like, who said that? Like, I have no
There
clue.
is an actually, yeah. I totally forgot
I
his
think it's
name,
a
but
Voltaire, maybe. I
yeah,
saw
Voltaire.
Voltaire.
Voltaire. It was Voltaire.
It
Yes,
was
you
actually
got it.
Voltaire.
Yeah, it was. It was.
Okay,
It was. It was him.
because I
It was
remember I
Voltaire.
googled it. I googled it recently. I'm like, I want to know who actually said this.
Yeah, it was
And it
Voltaire.
was
You got
Voltaire.
it. You got it.
Yeah.
Um. So, I think that really needs to apply. Um. I'll say it is hard though. It is hard to determine when it's not free speech anymore. And I think you said it at the beginning of your argument just now. I mean, there are instances that obviously have nothing to do with free speech anymore. Like there are actual calls for, like, actual signs of people saying, you I will, I'll like that to you, or like
Mhm.
people actually chanting like, I will kill you if I see them. Like, this those are things that
But
actually
wait,
happen.
wait. This is
Hmm.
I'm going to interrupt you there because this
Yeah,
is where it
sure,
gets
go
like
ahead.
this is where it gets complicated because
Yeah,
like even like historically speaking, like abstract calls for violence, like
yeah,
if I say right now, like we should kill all Venezuelans, right? We should kill
yeah.
all people that speak Spanish or something.
You
Um,
shouldn't shut it down.
e-
Yeah, you should not shut that down.
even that is protected by
I
some
think
president.
I
So
think
so
the
it's
best.
like harassment, like individual harassment, is different. Like if I, for instance, like that sign pointing at the students, there's a case to be made there because you're pointing at them. You're saying like they should be killed, or if you like target an individual, and in this
Exactly.
case, if you target the Jews, there's a case to be made there now legally, but that's for the civil. That's in regards to civil rights.
Yeah.
Like that has
Civil
nothing to do
rights act. Yeah.
with free speech. You would have to use civil rights law at universities to target those individuals. And if you use existing laws, I think they have a point. But what I do think it's funny is that a lot of conservatives have historically they used to like hold free expression sacrosanct to the detriment of like the civil rights conversation. Like conservatives are the type of people who usually go like, I'd rather have a racist saying something racist than shutting it down because free expression. But now a lot of them are like, these people are anti-Semitic, so we're gonna shut it down, and we're gonna
Yeah.
use civil rights law. And it's like, I
I
thought you
think.
guys like didn't like that type of
Yeah, no,
thinking.
I agree. I think the best comparison really for this is, or the best equivalent is, uh, protesting for, against abortion,
Yeah,
which is a very similar act. If you've ever seen in DC during March, that they do their and
yeah, for March for Our Life. Yeah,
March for Life, yeah, and
do you
you can,
go?
what,
Do you
as
go?
I mean, I have seen tons of videos. I haven't been there, but
Oh yeah,
I
I
have
haven't
seen the
been.
tons of videos of like police between the two crowds. One side against abortion, one side defending life, and that's pretty much how it goes. Like it's a lot of tension, it's a lot of yelling, a lot of
Yeah,
everything, but that's how it
potential
goes.
violence,
Yeah, but it is potential violence.
which is the language that universities are using, which I don't like. They go like,
Yeah,
we want to avoid potential violence, and it's like,
mhm.
yeah, like I agree. Like we don't want potential violence. Maybe we should have the cops like around nearby,
Yeah, exactly.
but
Yes.
you can use that language to like shut down basically like anything. Like
Yeah, I would say
I
though.
could be like, I don't want Obama to speak at this university because like a lot of people hate Obama. So
Yeah.
safety concerns, like makes no
Well,
sense.
I'll say though, like the most relevant example right now is Columbia University because it was like the biggest site for protests lately, and I would say like New York is just a mess as it is. So I don't know how much I can judge as a such a failing city at this point.
Yeah,
It's just such a mess all over the place that I agree with the concept. By the way, I do think that free speech should prevail, but at the same time, I don't know how
yeah,
well equipped the city is for more struggles that they have. But
yeah. No, I
I'll
agree.
still defend that.
I agree with
Yeah.
you. I agree with you. Like it's a difficult. Like I wrote when I wrote that piece. It's on the hill. I I mainly wrote it because I do believe in this, and I do think that like we don't want the safetiest precedent, um, and because I saw a really strong response from a lot of like conservatives, which I disagree with.
Hmm.
Um, but when I put on my like university administrator hat or my government official hat on,
Hmm.
my New
Yeah.
York governor hat on, it's hard. Like it's
Oh yeah.
difficult. It's like
Absolutely.
you, of
Yeah.
course, you have free expression, and like for me, the answer is simple: defend free expression. But if I'm a university official, right?
You
I'm
gotta be
thinking about
pragmatic.
thinking
Yeah.
about students. I'm thinking about donors. I'm thinking about for how long is this going to happen? What are we going to
Yeah.
do if it gets bad? What is
Well,
going to happen to our
I heard
reputation?
like the commencement, like the graduation for many students was happening very soon, and
Yeah.
many students had to go home. So students weren't even going to be at campus, and these people were still protesting there. And I think that's when the action was taken. So you know, it's hard because when it comes down to being pragmatic with something like this, especially when they have become very advanced in the things that they do. Like they cover their faces and they put TikToks up there. Like you gotta cover your face. You gotta make sure nobody knows you. If you're gonna do something illegal, make sure that nobody is seeing who you are. Like they are being instructed by people online what to do step by step. Um, so
Yeah.
it's a hard one. It's
At the same time, like I hate to do this. Like this is a problem that I constantly find myself in. I was on the radio. I was on the radio recently, and we're talking about this issue, sometimes it feels like I think some people are going to hear this and they're going to be like, "This is a Hamas apologist. He hates Israel." Because like I try to be as fair as possible, but like I think a lot of students like, of course, we don't like when people like hide their faces, especially at a protest, because we're like,
Mhm.
"Why are you doing this? That might be dangerous." But to be fair, like a lot of these kids are afraid that they're not going to be able to like get employment in
Yeah,
the
get
future.
employment or go to
Yeah,
college. Yeah, for sure.
or they're afraid they might get put on a list and potentially I don't know maybe expelled if something bad happens.
Hmm.
So it's more complicated than that. But I
Yeah.
keep seeing a lot of people simplify the conversation and they go like they're hiding their faces just like they do in Iraq, and it's like okay,
Yeah,
man.
no.
Okay.
No. I think you got a point. You're right. When it comes, yeah, free expression should be protected. New York City is a disaster. I think both of those things are true. Um, and something else I was going to say about that, but all right, let's just jump to another topic. I just wanted to make sure that we tackle this one since we are
Yeah.
about to run out of time and want to make sure to have some more discussion.
Hmm.
I've seen you recently. You've been going to, and I forgot the program right now. I know that there was a guy you were talking against because he has a very leftist channel, um,
Ha!
and 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 I saw that you were arguing how blinded a lot of a lot of his viewers and himself was because
Yeah.
he was only pointing out that all the disgraces and victimism of being a black person in America.
Yeah.
Um, and well, obviously you were pushing back against that. So if you can talk a little bit more about that, and what was that discussion about, and what happened
Yeah.
there?
So I've had two debates now with Dr. Rashad Ritchie from the Young Turks, and it wasn't a debate, but I had a conversation before that too. And the issue with Dr. Rashad Ritchie, if you guys are watching this, go Google Juan Villasmil Rashad Ritchie, and you'll find it. Let me know if he really schooled me or if he really destroyed me, because I keep looking at it and I don't know if it's me being egotistical, but I'm like, he didn't win. Like, he's just using like a lot of fancy words and saying stupid stuff. So Rashad Ritchie, I'm not gonna dive into it, but like, he has like PhDs and lots of master's degrees, and he uses a lot of fancy language. And this is basically what happened in the conversation. I basically said, like, hey, in the US, we have equality under the law. And civil rights law was passed to make well, there's a lot of things. There's like in hiring, there's in like government more broadly, and so on. But basically, the Civil Rights Act was to avoid the use of race, sex, and other things in the treatment of individuals, as in to just extract the racial reasoning, for example, from, let's say, hiring decisions. And basically, if you're a private company and you use quotas, or if you have a policy of we're not going to employ black people, or we're not going to employ Latinos, or we're not going to employ people born in Somalia, the government can step in and say, like, hey, you're violating the Civil Rights Act. This is wrong. And interesting enough, under this principle of equality under the law, that applies to like white people as well. Does In regards to like sexual orientation, if you use the liberal conception, it applies, but that was not actually mentioned in the bill. And it happens to sex too. Like, technically speaking, if you're a company and you say we don't want men to work here, unless there's an actual explanation. Like, let's say you're like,
Yeah.
it's like a
Yeah,
woman's own.
it had to be justified. Like, you will not have it
Yeah,
for models in a competition, or
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's a,
Or if it's like an actual like let's say like a club for like men or something, or like
or in
it's
a
like a club.
beauty,
Yeah,
yeah.
like a mental health club for men. I don't know. I'm inventing something. Like, of course, you're not going to hire a woman there, but generally speaking, like, the whole principle of this is we're not going to discriminate against specific groups. And what we've seen today is that there's some companies that have been pretty clearly, if you use the traditional conception of civil rights era law, they've been discriminating against white people. And when you say that, like, a lot of people go, "What you say?" Because it's like, that's like very taboo to say, but it shouldn't. CVS, for instance, they have this policy where they only accept 50, they're moving toward a system where they accept 50% of their staff writers have to be BIPOC, which means like Black, Indigenous, person of color, and that's wrong, because, like, yeah, 60% of the population is still white. So if you're gonna
Mhm.
make it solely about like equity,
Proportions. Yeah.
yeah, proportions, that's still like not perfect. But
Yeah.
also because, like, that's exactly what the Civil Rights Act wanted to avoid.
Yes.
Even if it was passed primarily to help black people, which were the group of people mostly affected at the time, the purpose of the law was to avoid discrimination more broadly. That's why it doesn't just talk about black people. It talks about race, it talks about sex, it talks about national origin. And Rashad Ritchie he basically made this argument without saying it out loud. Like, I
Of
try to
course.
pressure him because, like, Martin Luther King said X and the microcosm and the macrocosm, and he used all these stupid language, this advanced diction. to basically say that if you're a company and you say we don't want to employ white people, that's okay. But if you say we don't want to employ black people, that's bad.
Hmm.
And I think that's wrong. I think we should get rid of that racial hiring in general. And sorry if
Yeah.
I'm going too long, but
No, you're good.
before we move on, like I'm writing an article about this, and it's hard to get it published because it's like controversial a controversial like topic. But I really want to do it because I do believe this like firmly. Um, Aside from the legalistic conversation, there's also a social conversation to be had. And I try to have this with Richie, but he interrupted me. Um, what I try to say is that if we want to move forward as a country and reduce social tension, and actually, if we want Black people to be helped by the system, it might be better to talk more about the common threats to all Americans. Like if we talk about poverty, if we talked about like how basically like having a household with a single income is increasingly hard, if we talked about the effects of illegal immigration, if we talked about the effects of homelessness, then you can avoid the controversial racial dynamics.
Yeah.
And basically, in this process, Black people would be overwhelmingly helped because they're overwhelmingly poor. It's like if we
Yes.
pass a
You're right.
program tomorrow and the program is like trying to reduce poverty, and we use civil rights law, which is made to avoid discrimination in terms of race, then that program, technically speaking, would help Black people the most. And you know who agrees with me? Last thing. You know who agreed with me? Justice Marshall, the first Black man to hold a seat in the Supreme Court. Um, he actually said in one of his decisions that discrimination in hiring against white people is discrimination too.
Yeah.
So I think it's really funny. Like, if Justice Marshall was to talk to Rashad Ritchie, would Rashad Ritchie call him a race traitor or like a racist? It makes no sense, and we should all take a stand against this. Like, I know it's like, oh, like, the optics are not great. Like, I know it's like if you say like,
No,
hey, stop
I don't
discriminating
think.
against white
I
people, a
don't
lot
think.
of people,
I think that's only true when it comes from very left, very left groups, very leftist groups. Because when it comes, I mean, as you well said, even if you look at the proportions, and we're gonna talk about merely like proportions.
yeah,
If we were a country that really look very deeply into race and we were doing things correctly, quote unquote, then all companies should be required to hire based on the proportionality of the country, which means you can only
yeah,
hire 60% of white people and you
yeah,
can hire
50% of white people,
15% of black people,
14%
and
black people.
and yeah, and so your company has to be a representation of the country
Yeah,
based on the percentages. And that's not what happens. So obviously what's being practiced today is reverse discrimination. And
I would just call it
that's nuts.
discrimination. Like
Yeah,
by
which is discrimination, right? Like reverse discrimination is discrimination.
by
Um,
definition. Yeah.
so so that's what we are going through right now. And I don't think it's controversial. I think it's controversial only for those very leftist groups that believe that you need to have people that are black
Yeah.
all or provide all these further help for people of color. It's kind of inhumane because you are setting up a precedent that is
Yeah.
saying you are not good enough for society, so therefore we are going to save you because you're just not good enough. And I think that's all the race tension that we've seen in this country. um
Yeah. No, you have that's an excellent point. Um, because when you really think about it, the the truth is that, and this might be, a step ahead. I'm looking at the future. The truth is that today, when you look at a lot of surveys, and I invite your viewers to like Google this, um, because I don't have all the facts in my brain, but I was reading a survey recently where they asked white Americans the following question. Um, the question was, and I'm paraphrasing, um, who do you think is getting discriminated more in the last 5 years? Something like that. And white Americans, and they divide this by party. So 50% of Republicans think that white people are being discriminated more. And when you look at the overall population, they divide this. They have like a lot more, a bit more, about the same. And basically, when you look at the polling, the about the a lot more category for how white Americans judge how white Americans are being judged in regard to discrimination is extremely high, to the degree that there's a lot of surveys that show that like 51, 55, um, around 60, a little less, a little more, of white Americans believe that the system is increasingly discriminating against white people. And a lot of my liberal folks would look at that and they'll be like, "Oh my god, like imagine if they were black, imagine if they were Latino, like oh my god, these white people are crazy." And I went to a very liberal university, and their response is always something like that. It's like white guilt, like these white people, they just don't understand. Like they've been leading the world for years. What are they talking about? Like, what about slavery? And like I understand where they're coming from. Like, sure, if you if you look at history, like some groups have been more oppressed than others. That's true. But if we forget about history for a second, that sounds bad. But let's look at today, right now. Let's look at the current country. If we have uh, 60% of the population, right? If half of them, so let's say 30% of the population, believes that the system is rigged against them, and those numbers are sure to increase with time. And then we have the black population, around 13, 14 to 12% of the population, believes that the system is rigged against them for completely other reasons, right? And in some regions, um, Latinos are less big of a demographic, but Latinos are somewhere in the middle there. Like a lot of Latinos are like, okay, like I don't care about this dynamic, and then some of them are like, I'm oppressed too. So if we have all these factions in the country thinking that the system is rigged against them for completely different reasons, what do you think that might produce? If I'm, if I'm optimistic, it might produce some tensions, some fighting, maybe some riots, um, maybe some contested elections, maybe a lot of disagreement and screaming. But at worst, that could translate into a lot of violence, a lot of hatred, uh, more discrimination, and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that you're totally right about that. But uh, hey, it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming to the channel. I appreciate it. Appreciate your participation. I wish the best in your future endeavors and that you keep speaking out.